How you doing, guys? This is Eric from rulethewasteland.com. This video is going to be about three things that I think every prepper, certainly preppers, but probably every person should get over the next, basically as soon as possible. But I'll say the next few years, simply because I think that a lot of restrictions could arise that will, in these specific categories, we've already seen some of them happen. And yeah, without further ado, let's get to it. First one, passport. They're always trying to add more restrictions, more biometrics data and stuff like that to passports and travel documents, not to mention the amount of time that it takes to get one, regardless of what's going on. If you decide you need to go somewhere where a passport's required, then you're looking at least several weeks. If it's a situation where a lot of other people are trying to do it also, then it might be pushed back to several months. So I definitely recommend that everyone have this. If it gets really bad in some sort of disaster scenario where you'd have to smuggle yourself out or something, then it won't matter anyway. But it's almost never going to be a bad idea to make sure you have it somewhere. If you need to leave the country, even if they make some crazy restriction about that you would have to go through when you renew your passport to leave the country, there's certain ways that you might be able to still eke your way out with the old one if you're not going through a commercial, airline or something like that. Maybe you could go through a port or something like that. Not to mention getting into another country, even if you're able to get out of the U.S. just fine, it's unlikely that you'd be able to get into another country without some kind of documentation. If it's possible at all, it's a huge advantage to have a passport from more than one country or even just a different country than the US. I've always been worried that the at some point in the future, a U.S. passport could be fairly detrimental. If you can pass yourself off as being from, any other place, Canada, UK, certainly any even non-European country, then that's definitely an advantage. So if you have an ability due to your marital status or your ethnic background or whatever to get a second passport of some kind, I strongly, strongly suggest that. The second thing that you should get to prepare for changes in the future, some of which have already been happening over the past basically decade, but it's really ramped up in the past few years, is get hard copies of data. So right now behind me, I have Webster's Dictionary. This one's from like a nice massive tome. I got this fairly recently because I had been kind of dismayed with how often and suddenly definitions of words are being changed just on a whim based on political correctness, whatever the current cause du jour is, or the ideology of whoever's in charge of, you know, the search engines. We're entering a really dangerous time in terms of how our access to information is controlled by an oligarchy, basically, of a few small companies which are run by just a handful of people, which are in bed with governments all over the world. You'll see things like movies being edited after the fact, so the current version of what's online is different than what was in the theaters when it came out. Definitions of actual words are being changed just from what they were a few months ago to suit the current narrative. So you don't necessarily have to go as far back as the 60s, which is I didn't necessarily do on purpose. I think up until the year 2000 would be really safe, fairly safe, probably up till 2010, and anything after that is just probably garbage. And not to mention simply having a physical copy of data for in a grid down event where you don't have the internet. Our reliance on the internet is basically complete as a society at this point. It's utter and all encompassing. If the internet goes down on a widespread scale for any significant period of time, that would be almost as disastrous as an actual electrical grid down event, because so many things, including the power plants themselves in many situations, but law enforcement and emergency services, hospitals, every commerce, and would even a Walmart or a normal store be able to operate without the internet? So even if the goods are there, they would have no ability to sell them, things like that. So it would get really ugly really quick without the internet. And we rely on it for things like definitions, maps. I always recommend having an atlas and of your really detailed one for your immediate area, and simply a broader road atlas for probably the entire United States if you can. Contact information, just all that stuff. Any information you need for survival and prepping when it comes to how many drops of bleach to put into water to purify it, how to use all your gear. recipes for how to cook, things like that that we're so used to just looking up or maybe storing digitally. Having all that stuff in a physical copy could be make a big difference in the future. The third thing is a older vehicle that doesn't rely on a lot of electronics and specifically isn't controlled electronically in any way. They're always going to continue to make restrictions about what vehicles can do, what they're allowed to do. You know, they're certainly at some point going to put in controls in the vehicles, governors that regulate speed, possibly and almost certainly some sort of feature that allows the police to remote shut down a vehicle if they think that you need to be stopped for some reason. Now, obviously, eventually that's going to become a law, but having an older vehicle that doesn't have these features, they're often grandfathered in for at least some period of time. Just like with here in Vegas, we have to have the smog check for vehicles. They have to pass emission standards. I have the Bronco that I have, White Phillip. He's old enough that he doesn't have to go through the same stringent standards because it's considered a classic or collector's vehicle. So right now, I basically get to bypass a lot of these restrictions, and this is the same sort of effect that will carry on in the future with these other controls, at least for a period of time. It's not going to make you immune to these things forever. Once it gets to the point where all the vehicles are electric, they all have these remote shutdowns, they're going to continue to choke out the last few vehicles that don't have those features. But you'll get some more time, probably an extra 10 or 15 years, to be honest, maybe 20 to 30 years between when these features are first introduced to when they're becoming completely mandatory. Like, it'll very quickly happen that no new vehicles have these, or are without these features rather, but it'll be a while before they're mandated that no car can be on the road without them. And the smaller you get, like motorcycles, will probably get even more time, so that's something to look into. The prepping capabilities of motorcycles in terms of hauling stuff and people are diminished, obviously, but they're not without their benefits as well, for being able to fit certain places, off-road a lot easier, really good gas mileage, things like that. So it doesn't have to be really, really old. I'm talking about anything. So certainly anything pre-2000 and even up to 2010 or whatever is usually going to be fine. It doesn't have to be completely without electronics unless you're worried about EMP protection. And even then, most vehicles that were tested in that EMP test were at least able to start back up again. But keep in mind when that test was performed too. It may have been like 2002 or something like that. So now if you go to a new vehicle, they have all sorts of electronic controls. The key fob, there's not even a key, it's a push start. There's all sorts of cameras and sensors that stop it from moving sometimes. The doors can't close, the car can't start if the doors are open, and all these other things that not only limit the way you can use the vehicle in a crazy situation, but also make it a lot harder to fix and maintain yourself, and make it a lot easier for it to run afoul of various regulations and things like that. And so the older you get it to begin with, the more easily it's going to be grandfathered in. Like right now, like I mentioned with the classic collector vehicles or classic rod or whatever it is, if it's 25 years old, it automatically already falls into that kind of grandfathered in category where you can bypass a lot of the emission standards. And then certainly you don't have to worry about a lot of the electronic stuff as well. And also, the older it is to a point, the easier and cheaper it is to fix it. Now, if you get really, really old to where they're just not making the parts anymore, then it's obviously going to be more expensive to find parts for it, but also usually easier to fix. So like with the Broncos and the F-150s were very similar, practically identical, and they spanned 15, 20-year period where the parts are practically interchangeable. So there's a lot of parts out there for spares, a lot of companies making these parts because they're very popular vehicles. So you can get something like that. Even a lot of the Toyotas, the early 90 Toyotas were basically invincible, and if not ugly, whatever, good gas mileage, invincible, lots of parts, much easier to fix. So I recommend having some sort of beater vehicle that just is grandfathered in, so it's not going to be attacked by all these restrictions when they first come about. You might get an extra 10 to 20 years out of it, to where someone can't shut down your car remotely or automatically track it and things like that. So let me know what you guys think about those 3 things. If you have any of them, which ones you think are the most important. Check out rulethewasteland.com. I'll talk to you guys later.